The champagne glass shattered against the marble floor before anyone in the ballroom had time to draw a breath. Every sequined shoulder in the room turned. Every polished head swiveled. 300 of the city's wealthiest, most carefully curated guests stood frozen beneath the cascading light of the Harrington Grand Hotel's crystal chandeliers, and every single pair of eyes landed on the same thing. Marcus Webb, standing at the center of the room in a slightly ill-fitting charcoal suit, staring at the spreading puddle of moat at his feet. His wife, Celeste Webb, stood 3 feet away from him, her hand still raised from the motion of knocking the glass out of his grip. Her gown, custom Valentino, deep emerald, caught the light beautifully. Her jaw was set. Her eyes were blazing. "I told you not to speak," she said, loud enough for the nearest 30 people to hear. "I told you to stand there and smile. That is all I needed from you tonight, Marcus. One thing." Marcus didn't move. He looked down at the broken glass, then slowly back up at her. "Celeste." "No." She cut him off with a sharpness that made several women nearby flinch. "Do you know who is in this room right now? Do you have any idea who I've spent the last 6 months cultivating relationships with so that tonight could go perfectly?" She gestured behind her, wide, sweeping, theatrical. "Senator Aldridge, the Fontaine family, Gerald Marsh from the Foundation Board. And you decided, in front of all of them, to open your mouth and tell a story about a fishing trip." A ripple of uncomfortable laughter moved through the nearest cluster of guests. It died almost immediately. "It was a conversation, Celeste," Marcus said quietly. "Gerald asked me a question." Gerald was being polite. Her voice cracked higher, and she seemed to catch herself, lowering it just slightly, though not nearly enough. "He doesn't care about you. None of these people care about you. They're here for me. This gala is for my foundation, my work, and the last thing I need is my husband derailing every interaction with small talk about bass fishing in Vermont." The silence around them had grown enormous. People had stopped pretending not to listen. Some of the braver guests had taken half a step closer. Marcus said nothing for a moment. He just looked at her. His expression wasn't angry. It wasn't crushed. It was something harder to read, something that looked almost like patience wearing very, very thin. "You're right," he said finally. "I'll stay out of your way." He turned and walked toward the far edge of the ballroom, toward the tall windows that looked out over the city skyline. Celeste watched him go, then turned back to the room with a bright, practiced smile. "I'm so sorry about that," she said to no one and everyone. "You know how it is." A few people smiled back, politely, the way people smile when they've witnessed something they wish they hadn't. Gerald Marsh, a silver-haired man in his late 60s with kind eyes and a quiet bearing, did not smile. He stood just to Celeste's left, and he watched Marcus walk away with an expression that was very different from the one she might have expected. Celeste Webb had built her life the way other people built monuments, deliberately, expensively, and with an obsessive attention to how it would look from the outside. She had grown up the daughter of a successful architect and a socialite mother who had drilled into her from the time she was 8 years old that the right rooms mattered more than anything else. The right school, the right neighborhood, the right friends, the right husband. Marcus had been, once upon a time, everything she thought she wanted. Steady, warm, quietly intelligent. He had his own small business, an architectural salvage company that sourced antique materials for high-end restoration projects, and when they'd met 12 years ago at a mutual friend's dinner party, she'd found his unpretentious confidence attractive. That was before the foundation, before the galas, before Celeste had realized that the social world she was building required a very specific kind of husband, and Marcus, for all his good qualities, was not that husband. He didn't care about appearances the way she did. He wore what was comfortable. He talked to caterers and security guards the same way he talked to CEOs. He had absolutely no instinct for reading a room and adjusting himself accordingly, and at every event she brought him to, he seemed constitutionally incapable of simply standing still and looking the part. She had tried to explain it to him. She had tried patience. She had tried gentle correction. She had tried the kind of sharp, clinical feedback she gave her junior staff. Nothing changed Marcus. He just kept being exactly who he was, as if that were somehow enough. It had stopped being enough for Celeste a long time ago. What she hadn't told him, what she hadn't told anyone, was that she'd already spoken to her attorney. The divorce papers were sitting in her desk at home, third drawer on the left, waiting for the right moment. After tonight, after the foundation gala, after the photographs were taken and the donors were secured, and she no longer needed a husband standing beside her in the publicity materials. Tonight was supposed to be her crowning moment, and he had almost ruined it. Marcus stood at the window with a glass of sparkling water and watched the city breathe below him. He had known this night was coming for a while now. Not this specific night, not this specific scene with the champagne glass, but the general shape of it. He'd felt the marriage unwinding for 2 years, slowly at first, then faster, the way a thread pulls when you don't catch it in time. He wasn't angry with Celeste. He had moved past angry somewhere around the 14-month mark. What he felt now was something closer to grief, and underneath the grief, something else entirely, a kind of quiet certainty that had been growing steadily for the past 6 weeks, since the phone call that had changed everything. Mr. Webb. He turned. A young woman in hotel staff black stood at his elbow, her expression apologetic. "There's a gentleman asking for you at the east entrance. He says it's urgent. He gave me this to give to you." She held out a small cream card. Marcus took it. He looked at the name printed on it, and something shifted in his face. "Thank you," he said. "Tell him I'll be right there." He set his water glass on a nearby tray and moved through the crowd without looking back toward the center of the room, where Celeste was now laughing at something Senator Aldridge had said, her hand on his arm, her smile brilliant and practiced and perfect. At the east entrance, standing just inside the tall bronze doors, was a man named Arthur Calloway. Arthur was 81 years old, small and lean in a dark navy suit that had probably been expensive 30 years ago and had been cared for meticulously since. He had a full head of white hair and eyes the color of sea glass, and he was leaning on a cane not because he needed to, but because he said it gave him something to do with his hands. "Marcus." He extended his free hand, and Marcus took it in both of his. "Arthur, you didn't have to come in person." "Yes, I did." Arthur looked at him steadily. "It's that kind of news." They moved to a small alcove off the main corridor, away from the foot traffic of the gala. A passing waiter offered them drinks. Arthur took a club soda, and Marcus declined. "The board met this afternoon," Arthur said, without preamble. "Final vote. Unanimous." He paused. "The Calloway Foundation is yours, Marcus. Full stewardship. Everything." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of 12 years of history, of Marcus having met Arthur Calloway not at a gala or a fundraiser or a networking event, but in a salvage yard outside of Burlington, Vermont, where Arthur had been hunting for original 19th-century window casings for the restoration of a house his late wife had loved. They had talked for 4 hours that day, about architecture and history and what it meant to preserve things, about Arthur's wife, Eleanor, who had died the year before, about loss and what you built in its wake. Arthur had no children. He had a foundation, the Calloway Foundation for Historic Preservation, and assets in excess of $800 million, and a 12-year friendship with a man who had never once asked him for anything, had never brought up money, had never angled for an introduction or dropped a hint or done anything except show up every few months to have coffee and talk about buildings. "Arthur," Marcus said carefully, "we talked about this. I told you I didn't want. You told me you weren't interested in my money," Arthur said, "and that's exactly why it's going to you. Along with the board seat. Along with the stewardship portfolio. Along with everything Eleanor and I spent 40 years building." He held up one hand. "I'm not asking your permission. It's done. The lawyers finalized it this morning. I came tonight because I wanted to tell you myself and because..." He glanced toward the ballroom doors. "Because I thought it might be a useful night for you to have this information." Marcus looked at him. "What does that mean?" Arthur's expression was kind and knowing, and just slightly rueful. "It means I've been watching that woman drain the color out of you for 3 years. And it means I'm an old man who spent 40 years learning that some nights change everything, and I wanted to make sure you had what you needed when this one did." Back inside the ballroom, Celeste was at the peak of her evening. She had worked the room with surgical precision. Gerald Marsh from the foundation board, drawn into a 20-minute conversation that ended with him nodding seriously and mentioning the endowment review in October. Senator Aldridge, charmed and photographed and personally invited to the March benefit luncheon. Helena Fontaine, who had been notoriously reluctant to commit to any cause publicly, now deep in conversation with Celeste's deputy director about the new literacy initiative. It was working. It was all working. The only blemish on the evening was Marcus, who had vanished for nearly 45 minutes and whom she'd spotted twice in the periphery of the room, talking to, she'd had to look twice, Arthur Calloway. She didn't know Arthur well. She knew of him, the way anyone in philanthropic circles knew of him, legendary figure, enormous wealth, reclusive, famously impossible to get a meeting with. She had tried twice through proper channels to secure an introduction and been quietly rebuffed both times. She watched them from across the room and felt a slow, twisting irritation. Of course Marcus knew Arthur Calloway. Marcus knew everyone in the most inexplicable ways, always through some sideways, unglamorous route, some salvage yard, some hiking trail, some diner in the middle of nowhere, and it produced nothing because Marcus had no idea how to leverage a connection into an opportunity. He probably talked to Arthur Calloway about woodworking or weather patterns. She turned back to Helena Fontaine and did not think about it again. Until the program began. The program for the Celeste Webb Foundation Gala was carefully choreographed. Welcome remarks from Celeste. A short video about the foundation's work. Remarks from Senator Aldridge. Dessert. Then the evening centerpiece, the announcement of the foundation's new 5-year initiative and the introduction of its lead funding partner. Celeste took the stage at 9:43 with 300 people watching and the quiet confidence of a woman who had prepared for this moment for 6 months. She was good at this. She was genuinely, brilliantly good at this. She spoke about the foundation's work with the kind of clarity and passion that made people reach for their checkbooks without quite meaning to. She told a story about a 9-year-old girl in a rural county who had learned to read through one of their early programs and was now, at 17, applying to college. She didn't over-sentimentalize it. She let it breathe. The applause was warm and genuine. Then she introduced Senator Aldridge, who was brief and gracious, and sat down. Then it was time for the announcement. The next phase of the Webb Foundation's work, Celeste said, letting the room settle into full attention, requires the kind of partnership that only comes when two organizations truly share a vision. I am honored, and I want to say this with the weight it deserves, genuinely honored to announce that beginning in January, we will be partnering with. From the back of the room, a door opened. The foundation's executive director, Claire, appeared at the edge of the stage and leaned toward the MC, who leaned toward the AV technician, who came to the edge of the stage and caught Celeste's eye. She kept smiling. She leaned over. He whispered something to her. She straightened. For just a moment, one fraction of 1 second, the composure cracked. Then she recovered. She turned back to the microphone. I've just been informed, she said carefully, that we have an addition to this evening's program. We'll hear the partnership announcement momentarily, but first I'd like to invite. She looked toward the back of the room. Arthur Calloway was walking toward the stage. Marcus was walking beside him. The room did something interesting. It stilled in a way that was different from ordinary polite attention. People who had been half-checking their phones put them away. People who had been leaning toward their table companions straightened up. Arthur Calloway had that effect. He always had. It was the quality that the genuinely powerful have, not the loud, bought kind of power, but the kind that has been quietly, consistently real for so many decades that a room can feel it walk in. He moved slowly but without any suggestion of frailty, and Marcus walked beside him with one hand at his elbow, not guiding, just available. And something about the ease between them, the obvious comfort of two people who had known each other for a long time, made several people frown in concentration, trying to place it. Arthur took the microphone from the stand with a quiet thank you to Celeste, who stepped aside with a smile that was working very hard. Good evening, Arthur said. My name is Arthur Calloway. Most of you don't know me, and I prefer it that way, so what I'm about to do is somewhat out of character. A small ripple of warm laughter. I'll be brief, because I'm 81 and I'm tired, and I want to eat dessert before they clear the tables. More laughter, easier this time. I've spent 40 years building something with my wife, Eleanor, the Callaway Foundation for Historic Preservation. It is the most important work of my life outside of my marriage. Eleanor died 3 years ago. Since then I've been doing what old men do when they're trying to honor something enormous. I've been very, very careful about what comes next. He paused. I found what comes next 12 years ago in a salvage yard in Vermont. I just took a while to formalize it. He looked at Marcus. Marcus looked back at him, steady, his expression open in the way it always was. Effective as of this morning, Arthur said, turning back to the room. The Callaway Foundation, its entire endowment, its board, its mission, and its future, is under the stewardship of Marcus Webb. The silence was immediate and total. It was the kind of silence that happens when 300 people simultaneously recalibrate everything they thought they knew about a room. Marcus has been my friend for 12 years, Arthur continued, his voice steady and quiet and carrying perfectly. He has never asked me for a single thing. He has never maneuvered, never leveraged, never positioned. He has shown up, reliably and genuinely, as a person of extraordinary integrity, and those are precisely the qualities Eleanor and I spent our lives looking for and rarely found. A pause. You'll be hearing a great deal about the Callaway Foundation in the coming months. I wanted to take this opportunity to introduce its new director properly and in good company. He turned to Marcus. Say something. Marcus stepped to the microphone. He looked out at the room for a moment, unhurried. I'm not going to try to follow that, he said. Arthur is a hard act to follow under any circumstances. He paused. What I will say is that the Callaway Foundation's work, preserving built history, protecting the physical record of how people lived, is something I believe matters. Not abstractly. Concretely. The things we build outlast us. The things we save outlast us. And the people we choose to be in rooms where no one is watching. He paused for just a beat. Those things outlast us too. He stepped back from the microphone. 3 seconds of silence. Then Gerald Marsh stood up. He stood alone for a moment, his chair scraping back, his face serious, his applause deliberate and unhurried. Then the woman next to him stood. Then Senator Aldridge. Then Helena Fontaine. Then the rest of the room, in a wave that moved from the front tables to the back in the space of about 10 seconds, until 300 people were on their feet. Standing ovation. For Marcus Webb, who had, 45 minutes earlier, been standing in a puddle of spilled champagne while his wife told a room full of strangers that he had nothing worth saying. Celeste stood at the edge of the stage. Her hands were clasped in front of her. Her smile was in place. It was a very good smile, technically. But her eyes were doing something her smile couldn't cover, a rapid, private accounting that anyone watching closely could see. The numbers were not adding up in her favor. $800 million under Marcus's stewardship. A Callaway Foundation board seat. A 12-year friendship that had been sitting there, unannounced, the entire time she had been managing and minimizing and telling him to stand in the corner and be quiet. The divorce papers in her desk. The champagne glass on the floor. The 30 people who had hurt her. Gerald Marsh, who had watched Marcus walk away with an expression she now understood very differently. She became aware, with a slow and nauseating precision, that she had spent the last 6 months preparing for the most important night of her professional life, and that she had spent it next to the most quietly significant person in the room without ever once knowing it, because she had long since stopped looking at him closely enough to see. The applause took a long time to settle. When it did, people moved, toward Marcus, toward Arthur, toward each other in the buzzing, energized way of a room that has just witnessed something it hadn't expected. Gerald Marsh reached Marcus first, which Celeste saw from across the room, and the handshake between them lasted long enough to mean something. Helena Fontaine was next, and she said something that made Marcus laugh, a real laugh, easy and unguarded, the same laugh Celeste had once found charming and had spent the last 3 years finding embarrassing. She stood where she was and watched her husband become, in real time, the most interesting person in the room she had spent 6 months building. Later, much later, When the gala had wound down and the hotel staff was clearing the last of the tables, Marcus found Celeste in the corridor outside the ballroom, her heels in one hand, her phone in the other. She looked up when she heard him. For a moment neither of them said anything. "Congratulations," she said finally. Her voice was flat and controlled, which was the only kind of voice she had left at this point in the night. "Thank you. How long have you known?" "Arthur told me 6 weeks ago it was a possibility. The vote was today." She nodded slowly. "And you didn't tell me. You didn't ask." He said it without heat, without cruelty. Just the plain fact of it. "You haven't asked me much of anything in a long time, Celeste." She looked at him. Something moved across her face that she couldn't entirely suppress. Not quite regret, not quite sorrow, but something in that neighborhood. "Marcus. There's something in my desk," she said.
She stopped.
She started again. "I need you to know that before tonight, I had already." "I know," he said. She blinked. "You know. Your attorney's office called the house by mistake last month. They left a message." He kept his expression even. "I didn't bring it up because I was trying to find the right time, and then I realized there probably wasn't going to be a right time, and that maybe that meant something." The corridor was quiet. Somewhere down the hall, a cart of glassware rattled past. "I don't know how we got here," Celeste said, and the honesty in it surprised even her. "I think we got here the way most things fall apart," Marcus said. Slowly, and then all at once. "I stopped being what you needed me to be. Or maybe what you needed me to be changed, and I didn't change with it. I'm not entirely sure which one it was."
He paused.
"But I don't think it matters much anymore." She looked at him for a long moment, really looked at him, the way she hadn't in years. At the steadiness in him, the unhurried, uncomplicated way he occupied the space he was in. The quality that Arthur Calloway had apparently recognized 12 years ago in a salvage yard, and that Celeste had spent 3 years treating as a deficiency. "I'm sorry," she said, "about earlier, with the glass." "I know. That was," she stopped. "There's no version of that was acceptable." "No," he agreed. "There wasn't." Another silence, softer than the one in the ballroom. "What happens now?" she asked. Marcus considered the question. "I think the paperwork that's in your desk probably tells us what happens next. And I think," he exhaled slowly, "I think we both know that's probably the right call. Just maybe for different reasons than you were expecting this morning." Celeste almost said something else. She had several things she could have said, defenses and redirections, and the kind of reframing that had always served her well in difficult conversations. But she looked at Marcus's face and understood, with a clarity that was uncomfortable and final, that none of them would work. Not because he would argue with them. Because he wouldn't. He would just look at her, steady and quiet, the way he always did, and the words would land on nothing and fall. "Good night, Celeste," he said. He walked down the corridor toward the hotel exit, his hands easy at his sides, his pace unhurried. She watched him go. 3 months later, the Webb divorce was finalized, quietly, cleanly, without spectacle. Celeste got the condo and her foundation's continued operation. Marcus got what he already had. The Calloway Foundation's first initiative under Marcus's stewardship was announced in January, a $60 million preservation fund targeting historic structures in under-resourced rural counties, precisely the kind of communities that had been invisible to the major philanthropic world for decades. The announcement ran in every major paper and several international publications. Gerald Marsh, who sat on the initiative's advisory board, gave a quote to the Times that was reproduced widely. Helena Fontaine committed $2 million before the end of the month. Marcus moved into a smaller place on the east side of the city, the kind of apartment with high ceilings and old bones and original plasterwork that he could see the entire history of if he looked closely enough. He didn't throw any galas. He did, occasionally, get calls from the people who had been in the ballroom that night, senators and foundation chairs and old money inheritors who had stood in that wave of applause and watched a man absorb humiliation without flinching and walk away from it without performing, and who had found that somehow more memorable than anything else they'd witnessed that year. He took the calls he felt like taking and returned them when he was ready and said no to the things that didn't matter and yes to the things that did. Arthur Calloway, On an afternoon in late February, sat across from him in Marcus's new kitchen over terrible instant coffee and told him Eleanor would have liked him enormously. She had a talent, Arthur said, for recognizing the ones who weren't performing. Marcus wrapped both hands around his mug. What's the difference, do you think, between performing and just being? Arthur thought about it for a moment. Outside, the city moved through its ordinary afternoon. Performing, Arthur said, is when you need the room to believe something about you. Being is when it doesn't matter what the room thinks, because you already know what's true. He looked at Marcus over the rim of his cup. You've always known what's true, son. That's the whole of it. The Harrington Grand Hotel would host dozens of galas in the years that followed. People in the philanthropic world would talk about the Webb Foundation Gala for a long time, not for the initiative that was announced, not for Senator Aldridge's remarks, not even for the partnership that Celeste had spent 6 months arranging. They would talk about the man in the ill-fitting charcoal suit who had stood in the broken glass and said nothing, and who had walked to the back of the room and come back to the front of it, and whom 300 people had risen for without entirely knowing why, except that some things do not need explaining. Some things you just recognize. The way you recognize an old building with good bones. The way you know before anyone tells you that something was built to last. If this story moved you, drop a comment below and let us know what moment hit hardest. We read every single one. And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button now so you never miss a story like this one. Likes help this channel reach more people who need to hear these kinds of stories. So if this one earned it, go ahead and tap that like button before you leave.